Good afternoon. My name is Dounis, and I'm the first speaker for the negative team, which includes myself, Kitty, which is Catherine, and Melanie, Mel. As the first speaker, initially I will be addressing a particular point which Leanne from the affirmative team argued in relation to the Human Rights Commission Act. Moreover, it is my intention to introduce and identify key ideas and opinions which will be discussed by the negative case team, referred particularly to orderly migration and the criminal activity of people smuggling. I will argue each point briefly by providing a clear overview of a number of points and providing factual information and evidence, the theories that assist my arguments as well. I will also focus particularly on Australia's contribution and obligation to assist and protect refugees and asylum seekers. Leanne discussed the Australian Human Rights Commission and their act and obligation for every non-citizen to be detained, regardless of individual circumstance, and that we need to accommodate them in Australia whilst their application is being progressed. Although this may appear correct, we fail to recognise the influx of people arriving on our shores and in turn overcrowding our detention centres. This impacts those who seek asylum through the appropriate channels. Therefore, the negative case team will be discussing points in support of our argument against onshore processing, which are as followed: queue jumping, which follow our aim to have low tolerance for people who arrive through irregular channels, the notion of fairness and concerns for those who abuse the Australian government system and the people who seek to enter through the appropriate channels, unfair consumption of resources and addressing asylum seekers who take advantage of this system and choose to falsely claim and seek asylum, as referred to as non-genuine refugees, the idea of illegality and unknown threats when processing onshore, recognising who is entering our country and the danger imposed in order to seek residency. And lastly, the protocol one must take when entering Australia and the links to ethics and our provision as a nation for asylum seekers. First, it is important to identify the definition of an asylum seeker. This refers to a person who needs protection and whose declaration for refugee status is undefined. UNHCR states that people who are referred to as seeking asylum are any person whose claim is lodged or pending. The given individual who enters the country with the customary or correct channels are abiding by the Australian law and the government. Therefore, isn't it our obligation as a country to favour those people and those individuals who are undertaking the appropriate processes? Consequently, queue jumpers are recognised as an individual who enters according to their own will and in an irregular and illegal manner. The Australian population are accommodating towards individuals who are seeking asylum as long as they are abiding and utilising appropriate channels in the correct manner. When people enter the country through a notion of irregular paths, it is against what is good and right and true. The way in which we consider people who need assistance and do come in correctly with the right procedure, thus putting them at a disadvantage. This action is unreasonable and in turn can lead to a range of social and economical problems for the Australian society as a whole. It is vital that Australia identifies who is arriving irregularly without good intention or for the purpose of residency and who are taking advantage of the Australian government and our resources. Therefore, it is important to note that people who elect to pursue residency and claim to be asylum seekers, that we as a nation establish the true reasons for the application of their asylum. In some cases, they are in fact not avoiding or escaping dangerous homelands, but rather seeking a better lifestyle and one which includes the valuable benefits offered by our Australian government. It is an established fact that Australia is one of the most livable countries in the world. We have public health care, we have freedom of speech, we have education for all, and equality in our race and gender. Accordingly, laws and policies have been implemented so as to uphold the status of the nation and the cycle of benefits provided by it. Our team agrees that people have the right to seek asylum in our country, that we have both the legal and moral obligation to process their claims for the common good. However, people must adhere to procedure as Australia provides for asylum seekers, provided that they seek to enter utilising the correct method of application. To further support our debate and demonstrate why the Australian government and the Australian people should be against onshore processing, an extract from a recent news report by former Prime Minister Mr. Kevin Rudd supports our views on offshore processing.
From now on, any asylum seeker who arrives in Australia by boat will have no chance of being settled in Australia as refugees. Asylum seekers taken to Christmas Island will be sent to Manus and elsewhere in Papua New Guinea for assessment of their refugee status. If they are found to be genuine refugees, they will be resettled in Papua New Guinea, an emerging economy with a strong future, a robust democracy, which is also a signatory to the United Nations Refugees Convention. If they are found not to be genuine refugees, they may be repatriated to their country of origin or be sent to a safe third country other than Australia. These arrangements are contained within the regional resettlement arrangement signed by myself and the Prime Minister of Papua New Guinea just now.
Therefore, we maintain our stance on agreeing that it is unfair, unreasonable, and illegal to falsely claim asylum. Moreover, it directly impacts those who are applying and awaiting asylum utilising the appropriate channels and procedures put in place by the Australian Government. In light of this statement, it is important to address illegal immigrants and their status and who elect to enter our country without conforming to regulations and who do not meet the legal and lawful requirements upon entry. It is valid to consider that the safety of Australian families and communities and their requirement to know who is entering our country and under what pretences they may have selected to enter, as only a minority of asylum seekers are recorded and registered with the United Nations High Commission of Refugees. This causes worry and concern and forces us to wonder who really is seeking residency in our country, Australia. We should take note that people who elect to disobey our laws and regulations are causing concern and worry for our nation. We must present a low tolerance for those people so as to prevent exploitation of not only Australian government but the Australian people. Therefore, when looking at this topic with an ethical lens and through the theory of utilitarianism, the laws need to be followed in order for society to function well and to have orderly migration systems. It is in our Christian tradition to act like Jesus and to take on ways of love and compassion, and this is exemplary by the Australian Government's program to uphold these values that Jesus holds. When asylum seekers arrive unjustly, this hinders other refugees waiting in humanitarian migration programs. The Australian Government prepared a humanitarian program by the Australian Department of Immigration, which focuses on assisting those overseas that require resettlement in alternate countries and consider Australia's international obligation onshore and under Refugee Convention. Moreover, offshore detention centres uphold the common good as they offer a measure of protection and assistance for all. They not only are designed and necessary for saving lives at sea, but also to dismantle the process of people smuggling and to ensure an orderly migration system occurs. These are all areas which are linked to promoting dignity and the common good for all. The Australian Government provides ample assistance for those who are seeking protection and possible resettlement in alternate countries. Therefore, being relocated to a detention centre is a lesser of evil as it maintains and provides for people in a safe and protected environment rather than sending them away to dangerous homelands and the potential for imminent threat. It is clearly evident that the facts that we have discussed lend support to our argument that refugees who enter Australia without according to the laws of this country should be processed offshore in order to maintain a systematic, fair and just evaluation of each case. Thank you for listening.
The topic that we will be debating is that asylum seekers who arrive irregularly in Australia should be processed onshore. An asylum seeker is a person who fled from their country because it was endangered, but they are not yet accepted as a refugee. Asylum seekers flee their country for their own safety and cannot return unless the situation that forced them to leave improves. These asylum seekers are seeking life in a better and safer country for themselves and their families. The idea of being processed on shore refers to the asylum seekers living in Australian detention centres while their documents are being processed and analysed. My name is Leanne, and I am the first speaker for the affirmative team. The other member in my team is Melanie. We believe that asylum seekers who arrive irregularly in Australia should be processed on shore. Asylum seekers should be able to be processed on shore as they have travelled a long way from countries where war and violence have led them to move away. These people are human beings just like us and have rights that need to be valued and respected. Human beings have a right to seek asylum where they want and not be turned down or sent to another country where they would not like to live. As the first speaker for the affirmative team, I will be discussing points that support the idea that asylum seekers should be processed on shore. I have taken into account moral and ethical values that reflect the onset of asylum seekers in our country. There are many points in which support the idea that asylum seekers should be processed on shore. The points I will be discussing throughout this debate are: my first point reflects the Catholic social teaching, dignity of the human person. As citizens of Australia, with the majority of Australians being Catholic, we all believe and abide by the Catholic social teachings, in which we intend to live our lives by respecting and valuing these teachings. The Catholic social teaching, dignity of the human person, resonates the idea that every human being has rights. My second point is in relation to another Catholic social teaching. The Catholic social teaching, the common good, looks at the idea that we should be working together as a community to help asylum seekers. My last and final point talks about the Mandatory Immigration Acts, which has laws reflecting asylum seekers and their rights. The first point I would like to raise is in relation to the Catholic social teaching that supports the idea that each and every human has rights which need to be valued and respected. This Catholic social teaching is called the dignity of the human person. This Catholic social teaching advises us that no human being should have their dignity or freedom compromised. This means that asylum seekers should not be disadvantaged and let into the country without being processed. As believers of the Christian faith, we believe every human being has a right to life. This Catholic social teaching reflects the idea that Australians have a moral obligation towards people seeking asylum. Through research, it is noticed and justified that there is no explanation for giving people who already have money and a life living in Australia. The concept of proximity cannot take over the moral and ethical principles of taking full responsibility for the needs of those who can't afford essential items such as food, clothes, and shelter. How would you like it if you were in a country where there was a war and you travelled months to get to a new place? And then, when you arrive, they say no, you can't come in here. How would you feel? Have a think about that. Catholics believe each and every person, no matter who they are, what they did, have a right to a quality life. The second point I would like to raise is in relation to the Catholic social teaching of the common good. The common good is another Catholic social teaching that supports the notion of asylum seekers being processed on shore. The common good is reached when we work together to improve the well-being of people in our society and the wider world. As believers of the Catholic faith, we need to work with all people to ensure a quality life for all. The asylum seekers cross oceans only to meet boats that turn them back to a place they were running from. Is that really fair? Australia has an obligation to help people who cannot help themselves. Australia is a first world country who can afford to have people coming in and living here. The Catholic Church recognises and values the morality and ethical values we need to consider when dealing with asylum seekers. As Australians who live in a first world country, we have the responsibility to ensure each and every human being are attaining equal rights and responsibilities. The asylum seekers who travel from their country to Australia should be processed on shore, as it reflects the Catholic social teachings and is just. In order for Australia to be the most moral and fair country, we need to process asylum seekers on shore. This way, asylum seekers can remain with human dignity, and it allows for the common good of all society. Lastly, I would like to bring up my final and main argument, which reflects a law from the Australian Human Rights Commission. I would like to arise the point that is stated within the Australian Human Rights Commission 2015 under the Mandatory Immigration Detention Category 2.1. It is indicated that it is mandatory under the Migration Act for every non-citizen who is in Australia without a valid visa to be detained, regardless of his or her individual circumstances. Once detained, unlawful non-citizens must remain in detention until they are either granted a visa or removed from Australia. This means that there is a law in the Australian Human Rights Commission that says that asylum seekers have a right to be processed on shore. It is vital that Australians abide by the mandatory laws and allow asylum seekers to live in Australian detention centres while their documents are being processed and analysed. How can you still be processing asylum seekers offshore when there is a law that clearly states that every human being has a right to remain in detention until notified otherwise? It is just plain wrong.
Hi, I'm Melanie Kent, and as the second speaker of the affirmative team, I believe that offshore processing of asylum seekers should not be allowed. I will be discussing the treatment of asylum seekers in processing centres which are based offshore and the costs of having processing offshore in comparison to processing within Australia and the costs it is to the Australian government. In rebuttal to Danielle's point, where she states that detention centres provide and promote protection and assistance for asylum seekers, these people are employed by the Australian government and there are many examples of articles and legal cases based upon the treatment of asylum seekers who are being processed offshore in Nauru and Manus Island in Papua New Guinea. There have been many reports from people who have been detained in these facilities who have been treated like animals, subjected to bride shopping, and sexually assaulted by guards. For my first point, I will be discussing how former social workers who worked at the detention centre in Nauru, who have released insider information about how the guards treated asylum seekers. Asylum seekers have made suicide pacts with other asylum seekers who have been treated like animals and would rather die than stay in detention with guards who treat them like this. If you or I were to come to the conclusion to make a pact to die because of the way you were treated and the conditions you were living in, there must be a serious problem within these facilities to occur. Many of the people in detention centres are segregated by gender and age, and many are lonely and do not have their family's support and love to help them while they are in these institutions. Some asylum seekers are purposefully hurting themselves to be transferred to an Australian detention centre to receive treatment and to be reunited with their families who are based in the Australian facilities, as well as escape the treatment of the guards in Nauru and Manus Island. Over 50% of asylum seekers within the processing centres which are based offshore have anxiety, depression and stress. These statistics are influenced by the treatment of asylum seekers by guards and workers, and those who are treated significantly worse, as many have mental and physical injuries, are not getting the necessary help they need. Though many asylum seekers have mental trauma and physical injury from the experiences while they had trying to arrive in Australia and from their native home, those who are hired by the Australian government to protect and help these desperate people should not be abusing their role by damaging physically and mentally the vulnerability of these people and taking the innocence of young children. Young girls and women have been victims of rape and sexual assault by those in Manus Island and Nauru and have been refused treatment or a release to an Australian facility. This is incomprehensible, as these people are humans and need to be treated with dignity and deserve the right to treatment. In Catholic social teachings, we are taught that every human being deserves to be treated with dignity. Treating an asylum seeker like an animal and sending them off to a processing centre in another country, which we would be appalled in if we were treated like that, do not deserve our money to treat these poor humans seeking a life free of terror and a life of opportunity. Regardless of who these people are, where they've come from and what they have experienced, if they're arriving in Australia as an asylum seeker, it is our duty to treat them like humans and keep them in Australia. Another Catholic social teaching which we should be using when looking after these people include the common good and the promotion of peace, along with dignity of the human person, promoting peace with asylum seekers instead of creating relationships where they dislike us for our choices we make for them. We need to think about not just ourselves, but the people who need us most, and while working alongside them, we can make our community flourish. My second point is in relation to the Australian government's cost to have Nauru and Papua New Guinea run these said processing centres for us. It costs the taxpayers $1.2 billion per annum to contract companies to run the facilities alone. If that money was spent in Australia, they could open and run many more detention centres, as it costs the government around $58,000 per detention centre to hold and process asylum seekers. This then allows the asylum seekers to be processed in a country where they have travelled to, and if the money that was spent in Nauru and Manus Island was spent here, it would create more jobs, as they would need to build more detention centres and have more staff to assist the processing of these people becoming refugees. As well as having more funds to spend on the actual process of processing these people, allowing for more asylum seekers to be granted refugee status, which then allows them the opportunity to live in our wonderful country. By processing asylum seekers faster, this allows the government to limit spending, as a lot of our funds are directed into medical treatment for those who are in detention and who have suffered helplessly in detention across Australia and abroad. To have this much money spent on offshore processing is beyond ridiculous, as the amount of money spent is going to countries who are allowed to mistreat and take advantage of traumatised people. Australia has currently 21 open facilities, which on average cost $1.2 million to run per year. This is significantly lower when compared to just 2 international centres, which cost 1,000 times more to run. The centres on Australian shores hold over 6,500 people in comparison to Nauru and Manus Island, which hold only 1,500 asylum seekers. The last financial year, the Immigration Department spent $474.1 million to operate the offshore processing centres in Nauru that hold 895 people, including children and family groups. According to these documents, this amount included $24.7 million just on healthcare, while the other $323.5 million was spent on welfare services, food, supplies, and security. Overall, the benefits of having processing offshore do not outweigh the benefits of having asylum seekers processed within Australia, as the treatment of these people is much better in comparison to those on Nauru or Manus Island, and the cost to the Australian government for having offshore processing is beyond ridiculous.
Hi, I am Melanie Hollibone, and the second speaker for the negative side of the debate, arguing asylum seekers who arrive irregularly in Australia should be processed offshore. Therefore, I am rebutting the second speaker for the affirmative side, who argues the Catholic social teachings of dignity of the human person and the common good support the argument of asylum seekers being processed on Australian shores. However, the Catholic social teaching, subsidiarity and participation, discusses how decision-making authorities should be recognising, respecting, protecting and promoting the rights and duties of everybody. By Australian government officials allowing asylum seekers who have not adhered to the appropriate procedures for seeking refugee status to be supported on Australian shores, whilst others who have taken the correct methods are being sent elsewhere whilst their claims are being processed, demonstrates a difference in the way people are being treated. Therefore, the government is not recognising, respecting, protecting and promoting the rights of everybody. They are putting one group of people above another. That defies what the Catholic social teachings are encouraging. Melanie also spoke about the Catholic social teaching of the common good, but processing asylum seekers offshore is promoting the common good. When asylum seekers are processed offshore, the common good is addressed as it provides an orderly process for all, whereby nobody is given preference over another. All claims will be dealt with in a timely and efficient manner, and will prevent the issues of fairness and queue jumping. The Catholic social teaching of the common good includes building a sense of community. Processing asylum seekers offshore promotes the creation of community spirit, as it has been said that Australians are more accepting and welcoming of asylum seekers who have adhered to the appropriate policies endorsed by the Australian government. It also promotes the common good of Australian citizens, as it ensures national protection and safety by having only people with confirmed refugee status and valid visas being allowed to enter into the country. Australia's asylum seeker policy states that people seeking asylum cannot be penalised for doing so without a valid visa or for their mode of arrival, as long as they present themselves to authorities as soon as possible and have real and true cause. However, how can we be sure that every person who comes into Australia without a valid visa will present themselves to authorities? These people are coming into our country without following the appropriate process and channels. Therefore, they are being accepted into our country before those who have lodged the appropriate documentation and are waiting for refugee status before entering Australia. Furthermore, those who are already in Australia seeking asylum have less options for resettlement as per the current policies of Australian government. This is supported by the speech Kevin Rudd delivered as he states they will have no chance of pending refugee status. So, it is in their best interest to start their process in accordance with the Australian asylum seeker policy. They are arriving irregularly, and in doing so, are disadvantaging those who have gone through the correct process by jumping the queue and delaying the people who are being held offshore until their claims are processed. This then brings issues about fairness concerns. It has been said that the Australian population are generally welcoming of refugees, as long as they have come into our country through the appropriate channels and processes. However, those who are arriving by unauthorised boats and are not following the Australian policy evoke very different opinions. These people are seen to be abusing the Australian government systems. Dr. Samantha Thomas, a senior research fellow in Monash Marketing Department, states if Australians feel asylum seekers have somehow jumped the queue or tried to sneak in, then there's quite a different reaction to them. But people are generally in support of Australia taking refugees. People feel that their personal values are being violated by the asylum seekers' behaviour. So it's not that Australians are not accepting of asylum seekers and refugees. It's just about them going through the correct processes to obtain refugee status. These negative attitudes also come from the fact that asylum seekers are using Australian taxpayers' money. This is money that could be going back into our economy, into our healthcare and education system, but instead is being used to support people who are arriving in our country without valid visas. In just 10 months, Australia has spent $265 million supporting asylum seekers who have come here through the incorrect channels and without claims for refugee status. Therefore, we are supporting people that may not even be genuine refugees. We don't know because they haven't lodged their claims for authorities to verify this. So, these people coming onto our shores without going through the right processes are being supported by our taxpayers' money, receiving the equivalent of welfare payments. We're also paying for the rent and furnishings of all the homes they are staying in, costing the Australian taxpayers $18 million this financial year, while we have homeless Australian citizens who aren't even supported. These expenses come to an average cost of just over $71,000 per person for a year based on the expected 40,000 asylum seekers awaiting their claims to be processed. That is a lot of money spent funding people who may not even have genuine refugee intentions. They are living on our shores, being supported by our taxpayers' money, yet we don't know if they're even eligible to be granted refugee status since their claims are still being processed or not even lodged yet. Consequently, we argue that all asylum seekers awaiting refugee status should be processed offshore in order to uphold the Catholic social teachings of subsidiarity and participation, and for the common good of themselves and the Australian nation. Furthermore, coming through the correct channels provides asylum seekers with more options for receiving refugee status without disadvantaging people like themselves. Also, offshore processing ensures that Australian taxpayers' money and resources are being spent on people with genuine claims of refugee status. Kitty will be supporting these claims by presenting further information about the genuine status of asylum seekers, the threat of terrorism, and also the harm of desperation.
Hi, my name's Catherine Wood and I'm the last speaker of the negative team. As the third and last speaker, I will discuss the perceived illegality of asylum seekers, the threat that they bring to Australia, and why it is safer for them to be processed offshore. To further Melanie's arguments, I will discuss the idea of genuine refugees and the damage that those with non-genuine intentions pose to our country. To conclude the debate, I will summarise both the positive and the negative team's arguments. The Australian Human Rights Commission defines asylum seekers as a person who has fled their own country and applied for protection as a refugee. However, this only becomes true if the person or persons are unable to willingly return to their country as they are at risk of being harmed due to their race, religion, nationality, belonging to certain social groups, or of particular political opinions. The idea of being sent back to these quite likely deadly origins is a fearful thought to anyone. I argue that the thought of returning to such a situation would make a man do unthinkable things in order to save his own life. This can be proved in such situations, such as the transportation of asylum seekers to locations other than Australia. When being transported, the passengers are not told their location, as it has been deemed a dangerous act on account of the links that they will take to get onto Australian soil. In an article published last year concerning the transportation of 157 Tamil asylum seekers, it was quoted that if the passengers from the Indian vessel were informed significantly prior to their arrival that they were being taken to India, they would take steps to prevent their effort to reach Australia from being thwarted. It's acts like these that demonstrates the desperation of asylum seekers and proves the lengths that will be gone to in order to reach Australia and its safety. It is at this point that I wish to make mention to the prominent negative public perception that asylum seekers are illegal and are a threat to the Australian public. Due to situations like that of the transportation of the Tamil asylum seekers, the Australian public perceive these people as being a threat to others and a threat to their homeland when they begin to threaten the dignity of human life. It goes against the Catholic social teachings that a man should put the life of another before his own. The social teaching argues that no person should be denied dignity because of their circumstances, and nor should one life be put before another. It is because of the desperation and actions demonstrated by some asylum seekers that we believe offshore processing is the safest precaution we can take to protect human dignity and the safety of Australian citizens. Another reason for processing asylum seekers offshore is so that the government is aware of who is entering Australia before they actually arrive. It was discovered that Australians associate asylum seekers as a threat of terrorism. If entering through the correct channels, then identity, intentions, and circumstances can be made known. If entering through more elusive methods, it is not known who these people are and what they are actually intending to do once they arrive in Australia. An article which discusses the association between terrorism and asylum seekers explores the notion that terrorists are never caught before the act. The only reason they are known to the public is because they have or attempted to harm our society. In 2013, an asylum seeker was released after being detained for concerns of terrorism. This asylum seeker was also a convicted Egyptian terrorist, and it was some time after he had arrived by boat before it was realised by authorities who he was. So how do we know that the people who are wanting to enter our country all have good intentions toward our society? Offshore processing allows us the time to process these people and ensure that they are not threats to Australian security. Finally, I argue that unauthorised boat arrivals are perceived as obtaining an unfair advantage over refugees in overseas camps. By arriving in Australia by boat, and unexpectedly, the country is forced to act in response. Not only do they commit injustice over those in situations such as their own, they commit injustice to and disregard Australia itself. Although some may not mean to, they have essentially cheated the system and taken advantage of the generosity and resources that Australia has to provide. I argue that offshore processing brings back the human dignity of all asylum seekers and realigns fairness and equity. In conclusion, offshore processing is essential to maintain and ensure Australia and its citizens' safety. Without it, we would open up our country to potentially dangerous and unknown identities with circumstances which remain unclear. Offshore processing enables Australia to ensure control of its security and maintain the safety of those who respect and appreciate the bounty of Australian resources and its law. I will now summarise the affirmative sides. So the affirmative side have argued that asylum seekers should be processed onshore. The first speaker's, Leanne's, argument worked on the basis that these people are leaving their country for a reason of self-preservation. Therefore, they deserve to seek safety after such a traumatic experience. Her arguments incorporated the Catholic social teachings of human dignity and the common good. She argues that the dignity of a human being should never be compromised, nor should their freedom. This worked alongside her second argument of contributing to the common good, where Australia should work to ensure the well-being and safety of our society and the wider world, and those who come to us in need. Her third and final argument concentrates on Australian Human Rights Commission law, arguing that according to this law, asylum seekers have the right to remain in Australia until they have been processed. In addition to these arguments, as the second affirmative speaker, Melanie Kent argues that offshore processing endangers the health and safety of asylum seekers due to the reality of sexual harassment, age and gender segregation, and mistreatment by guards. She also argues that onshore processing is more efficient and valuable to the Australian economy by creating more jobs through increased amount of detention centres and having a much lower running cost on welfare services, food supplies and security. The negative team began its arguments with Danielle. Danielle discusses the recognition of the humanitarian program provided by the Australian government. She discusses our country's willingness to provide care for asylum seekers, even though it's provided in alternate locations. Melanie H., the second speaker of the negative team, argued that the concerns of queue jumpers and how their avoidance of the proper processing can be a threat to themselves, the fairness of acceptance into Australia, and to national security. Melanie also highlighted the consumption of taxpayers' money and resources that asylum seekers expect. As the third and final speaker, I furthered Melanie's arguments of potential security threats by discussing the need for proper and orderly processing of those who are arriving on Australian shores to avoid unknown threats. I also discussed the jeopardy that desperation can cause to the human life, the links that will be gone to in order to reach Australia, and its safety. With this, I discussed the relevance of the Catholic social teaching, specifically the dignity of human life. These arguments prove that offshore processing is vital for the security of asylum seekers and Australian citizens. Thank you for listening to our debate. We hope you enjoyed it.